Today, I want to share 3 tips that I've learned over the years when composing a portrait image. This is going to improve your composition while on a shoot, but also provide options and tips when you're editing your images. But like always, guys, I want to show how to break these hard and fast rules to display visual interest, convey intent, and express your creativity. So let's jump right in with framing up your shot before you hit the shutter. Framing and composing a portrait is like cutting a piece of paper. You measure twice and you cut once. So you really have to think about where you want the edge of your frame to be, as you can always crop in later. But if you cut it too close, it's quite difficult to add those details back in, even with amazing tools like Photoshop's generative fill. And there's a few mistake patterns that a lot of us photographers make when composing and framing a portrait image. If you look at these 2 images, the composition almost looks identical. But the photo on the right is more visually pleasing as the model has sufficient feet and headroom, while the portrait on the left is jarring as the feet has been cut, and for a full body shot there's just not enough headroom to include the location of the image. This also confines the model without enough room to breathe in the composition. This has to be one of the most common mistakes when composing a portrait image, is cutting off the limbs in the incorrect place. So let me give you a quick 2-minute crash course on framing a portrait. If you want a full body portrait, make sure you have a bit of feet and headroom. I personally think that a 30-70% split looks the best, so the feet have 30% less area than headroom. For mid-body shots, you never want to cut the frame off at the knees or the shins, so never cut below the knees, always above. And it's either a mid shot or a full body shot. Nothing in between. Guys, as a general rule, avoid cutting off a portrait at any of the body's joints. Also, mid-body shots have a few variations depending on the model's outfit. For a short dress, for an example, I like to include a small portion of the legs, and the hemline actually acts as a joint. So I'll compose slightly above the knees, giving that hemline some breathing space. This technique adds length to the model's legs, unlike including the knees, which can make the legs look shorter and create a jarring composition. For a tighter mid shot, the stomach is also a deciding factor. I never like to crop directly in the middle of the stomach. I like to compose below or above, as there's a small portion of the stomach where you really have to decide if you want to include it or remove it. And this is particularly noticeable when you can see the skin, like a bikini, for an example. Moving up for headshots, this can get a little bit more tricky, as you can have the arm exit and re-enter the frame, which is extremely awkward to look at. So just like feet and legs, I never cut off at the limb of the elbow. The forearm and the hand are similar to the shin and the feet. They should either be included in the shot or left out entirely. Fitting the arms and the limbs in a tighter frame is more achievable with wider lenses like a 24 or 35mm, while longer focal lengths like the 85 or above, you start to see how the compression of the lens reduces that space within the frame. Finally, headshots and extreme close-ups, you should either include the shoulders and the neck or compose the image without them. Never cut the frame off of the neck, as it acts like a joint similar to the stomach. I do like to shoot about 5 or 10% wider to allow room for cropping. This also allows a shift in your center frame if the model is moving quickly, as when you crop in to center your portrait, you'll see your frame edges closing in quite fast to your desired crop in terms of headroom, for an example. Also, I do sometimes shoot a full body frame and then crop right into a mid shot later. That's the beauty of a full frame camera or this X-T5 with its 40 megapixel APS-C sensor. Lastly, for framing, and something you can't add or crop in later, is angles. I like to shoot from a low angle or a worm's eye position to empower the subject. Shooting from a high angle does the opposite, making the subject have a more vulnerable effect. Okay, so that's framing, but you'll see a lot of experienced photographers completely disregarding these rules to portray visual interest and tension in their images. Learning these rules is definitely the starting point, but learning how to break or bend these rules is a whole new ballgame. Things like having the horizon cut through the neck or a joint Dutch tilting an image, too much negative space, cropping at the forehead, etc, etc. Over time, learn other compositions that have balance and try it for yourself, as a perfectly composed portrait is technically great, but having a unique composition is creatively excellent. Tip number 2, lens selection. A lot of people think that the 85mm is the only and the best portrait lens. Well, I actually completely disagree with this. It is true that the 85mm will provide a pleasing perspective distortion to facial features at close distances, but when stepping back for a full body shot, that's where that compression will actually compress the height of the model, compared to a wider lens like a 24 or 35mm, which will do the opposite by extending the height of the model. Also, the 85mm lens is a hard lens to use when you want to communicate with the talent, as you're at that greater working distance. But I do love to use the 85 or a longer lens at busy locations like the beach to remove distractions from the frame, and it also compresses the light in the background. Wider focal lengths like the 24 or 35 are great for full to mid-body shots. This includes a lot of the environment of the scene, which can be a bit of a challenge to get a clean frame with no distractions in the background. But getting this right is a rewarding challenge and will create visual interest at an interesting perspective. These wide focal lengths for tighter frames like a headshot will create less pleasing distortion of facial features, making the head seem a lot fatter and just out of proportion. My most used portrait lens is the 50mm, as it's really the best of both worlds between a wide and a tight lens. You'll be at a comfortable working distance to the talent. It includes the environment for full body shots and provides realistic and pleasing distortion at close distances. That's because the 50mm focal length is very similar to what our eyes see in terms of compression and field of view. That's including your peripheral vision, of course. So the general rule of thumb is to use a wide focal length for wide establishing shots and a longer or tighter focal length for close-up portraits. But guys, just like framing, you got to study other photographers' work with unique focal lengths, and over time you'll train your eye to know what focal length they use and go out and try it for yourself. Photography is about interpretation and intent, not about the rules. Tip number 3, negative space versus filling the frame. There's no advantage over negative space and filling the frame, but including these two techniques within the gallery or collection of images is something I like to incorporate to add variety to my images. Negative space is definitely the hardest to get right, as this differentiates the good from the great photographers, as you have to be mindful of the distracting elements in the negative space, removing the attention from the subject. Our eye is drawn to the brightest and the most contrast part of an image, and in portrait photography, we want that to be the person who we are photographing. That's why we like to isolate our subject with shallow depth of field from a f1.4 prime lens. Negative space also makes the subject smaller and less dominant in the image, so that's another thing to consider, as you don't want the environment to overpower your subject. Negative space is a great technique to show off the space and the environment of the location, and also provides more dreamy, softer, or a charming effect, while filling the frame makes the subject more bold and dominant within the frame. You're also working at closer distances, which will give you more background separation depending on the focal length that you use. And there is a misconception that you have to use a wide focal length to get negative space, or shoot on a tight lens to fill the frame. While this is true for a lot of my work, sometimes I'll use a 50 or an 85mm for negative space. That dreamy out of focus background with a landscape orientation is a great method to get a clean image with negative space. Or I'll use my favorite wide angle focal length, the 28mm, to fill the frame. Like I said in the framing section of this video, this makes it easier for all of the limbs and body parts to aid in filling the frame with room to breathe, as longer focal lengths like the 85mm compresses the space too much. So before we wrap this video up, I want to provide a bit of a bonus tip that is the power of selecting the correct image with the best composition before importing and editing your images in Lightroom. I've been using this really powerful tool over the last few years called Narrative. Now, if you're not sure what Narrative is, it's a free software to download, no credit card required, with unlimited projects. Basically, it speeds up my workflow by allowing me to select the best in-focus image with their rating system. I can quickly scroll through and select the best composed image, and I can even crop the image before editing. With my selects, I import them straight into Lightroom. So not a sponsored video, but I do get a small kickback from a free sign up. So click the link in the description down below, enter your email and download Narrative, and enjoy the power of quickly selecting the best composed image that's also the best in focus image. In my last video, I actually did a complete portrait editing workflow on selecting and editing my portrait images with my presets. So that video will be linked here somewhere. But if you do like this soft film tone to my portrait images, go check out my Lightroom presets, which are linked at the top of the description. And all of my favorite lenses and gear for portrait photography is also linked below. And we will see you in the next one. Bye for now.